Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
not
to
once
outlaw
it was law.
discrimination.
No.
Well,
that's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. So and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while. You have voluntarily come into this studio and agreed to be questioned. Mm-hmm. A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's never happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law. That's what I said. And then the people who came after me said, oh, you must be transphobic and you mistreat a student in your class. It's like, I never mistreated a student in my class. I'm not transphobic, and that isn't what I said.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that
Well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian,
yes,
which they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right to speak for their whole community.
To compare them to Chairman Mao or... I could Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, this is grossly insensitive.
I didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
He was an authoritarian.
He's a right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians. Okay. And I do believe they are left-wing totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never say
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as when I say what I believe to be true, it's provocative. I don't provoke. Maybe for humor,
you don't set out to
now
provoke.
And then. I'm not interested in provoking.
But what about the thing about, fighting and the lobster? Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back. And it's an injunction to be combative, not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures. It's absolutely inevitable. And there is 1/3 of a billion years of evolutionary history behind that. Right? That's so long that 1/3 of a billion years ago, there weren't even trees. It's a long time. You have a mechanism in your brain that runs on serotonin that's similar to the lobster mechanism that tracks your status. And the higher your status, the better your emotions are regulated. So as your serotonin levels increase, you feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion.
So you're saying, like the lobsters, we're hardwired as men and women to do certain things, to sort of run along tram lines, and there's nothing we can do about it?
No, I'm not saying there's nothing we can do about it, because it's like in a chess game, right? There's lots of things that you can do, although you can't break the rules of the chess game and continue to play chess. And your biological nature is somewhat like that, is it sets the rules of the game, but within those rules you have a lot of leeway. But the idea that, one thing we can't do is say that hierarchical organization is a consequence of the capitalist patriarchy. It's like, that's patently absurd. It's wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It's seriously wrong.
Aren't you just whipping people up into a state of anger? And
not at all.
Divisions between men and women, you're stirring people up. You know, you have any critics of you online get absolutely lambasted by your followers.
And by me, generally.
Sorry, your critics get lambasted by you. I mean, isn't that irresponsible?
Not at all. If an academic is going to come after me and tell me that I'm not qualified and that I don't know what I'm talking about,
so you're not going to say to your followers now, quit the abuse, quit the anger?
Well, we'd need some substantial examples of the abuse and the anger before I could detail that question.
There's a lot of it out there.
Let's take a more general perspective on that. So I've had 25,000 letters since June, something like that, from people who told me that I've brought them back from the brink of destruction. And so I'm perfectly willing to put that up against the rather vague accusations that my followers are making the lives of people that I've targeted miserable.
What's in it for the women, though?
Well, what sort of partner do you want? Do you want an overgrown child? Or do you want someone to contend with that's going to help you and that you can rely on?
Women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity?
It depends on what they want. No, I mean, it's exactly how I laid it out. Like, women deeply want men who are competent and powerful. And I don't mean power in that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Power is competence. And why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a competent partner. So if you want domination...
Women want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say women who have had their relationships their relationships with men impaired, and who are afraid of such relationships, will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution.
Do you think that's what a lot of women are doing?
I think there's a substantial minority of women who do that. And I think it's very bad for them. They're very unhappy. It's very bad for their partners, although their partners get the advantage of not having to take any responsibility.
But what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
Okay, you said it was making them miserable.
Thing. Yes, it is. And it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time. But it's no formula for a successful long-term relationship. That's reciprocal, right? Any long-term relationship is reciprocal.
Hi, everyone. I have been asked by a few people if I would comment on the Channel 4 interview, Cathy Newman interviewing Jordan Peterson. And there's absolutely lots that I could say that has already been said amply by others. So I'm not going to do any kind of play-by-play of the entire thing, and I'm not going to concentrate much on the incredible number of times she appeared to purposely misunderstand things he said and then mirror back at him some completely batshit insane version of his views that she seemed to want her viewers to hear. So I'm going to try and confine myself to things that I haven't seen other people bring up, or maybe they haven't brought it up very often. And none of this is really meant as a criticism of Jordan's performance here. I mean, he did really well. Almost certainly way better than I would have been able to do in his position. And probably because I'm a woman and he's a man, the way he responded to the things that Cathy Newman was saying, in order to be successful, he would have had to respond differently than if I had been sitting there and answering those same questions or answering those same challenges. So this isn't in any way any kind of criticism of him. I think he did spectacularly, and it was essentially just the whole thing was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch. And he did indeed make her look like a fool over and over and over again. So, but there are definitely things that could have been brought up but weren't, whether it was because she was constantly interrupting and changing the subject when she saw things weren't going her way, or whether it was because he didn't think of them in that split second he had the opportunity to bring them up, or maybe because he was a man and it just wouldn't fly coming out of the mouth of a man. And also, his focus is very different from my own. And so some of the points that I'm going to raise here probably just aren't at the front of his mind most of the time. So I won't be playing the entire interview. I will just be using the specific clips from it that I want to concentrate on. And as always, the original video will be linked down there. So without further ado, here goes.
So what's gone wrong then?
Oh, God, all sorts of things have gone wrong. I don't think that young men hear words of encouragement. Some of them never in their entire lives, as far as I can tell. That's what they tell me. And the fact that the words that I've been speaking, the YouTube lectures that I've done and put online, for example, have had such a dramatic impact is an indication that young men are starving for this sort of message, because, like, why in the world would they have to derive it from a lecture on YouTube? You know, they're not being taught that it's important to develop yourself.
But does it bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive?
Does it bother you, Cathy, that feminism concerns itself with predominantly women? Is that divisive? I mean, here's the thing. People don't get to choose their audiences. The fans choose the rock star, not the other way around. I wish I had more women in my audience for a variety of reasons. I would guess Peterson probably wishes he had a more even mix of people interested in his lectures. I suspect he wishes the people who follow him would follow him for different reasons than they do. If nothing else, it would maybe suggest that he's saying things that people are interested in hearing, rather than things that a particular demographic of people are so desperate to hear because they never hear them anywhere else. When that message is essentially, if you get your shit together and do your best to be an honest, decent, fair-minded person, then you will have something of value to contribute to the world. Right? That's the message that he's getting at. And there are men out there who have never heard that before from anyone in their lives. And he just told you, Cathy, that young men in particular appear to be starving for this type of encouragement, this type of, I guess, validation, that they can build value within themselves and then contribute that in a positive way towards society, right? What does it say about the divisiveness of our society itself that young men so rarely hear that said to or about themselves?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's no more divisive than the fact that YouTube is primarily male and Tumblr is primarily female.
Isn't it?
Tumblr is primarily female.
But you're just saying that's the way it is.
Yeah, that's the way it is. No matter how much someone wants to be a rock star, it's the fans who get to decide. Now, maybe young women don't glom onto Peterson's message as much because they're doing comparatively okay. I don't know. Maybe because he's a man and his perspectives reflect that. You know, maybe that's why he just appeals more to men. Or maybe, just perhaps, it's infinitesimally possible that because the press, including you, constantly portray him as misogynistic, transphobic, and bigoted and horrible, you know, shall we say, divisive, maybe a lot of women are likely to avoid him.
Well, I'm not saying anything. It's just an observation that that's the way it is. There's plenty of women that are watching my lectures and coming to my talks and buying my books. It's just that the majority of them happen to be men.
What's in it for the women, though?
What a divisive thing to say, Cathy. First off, you yourself suggest that there's a crisis of, let's say, positive identity that affects half the population. Then you ask, well, what's in it for the other half? If someone had said there's a crisis in the black community that needs to be addressed, would you ask, what's in it for white people? More to the point, if you were to have said, there's a crisis among women in Britain, they're struggling in these ways and those ways, and something needs to be done about it, how would you react if men responded, okay, I guess something needs to be done, but what's in it for us? Do we or do we not want our society to serve, or at least try to serve, all the various people who live in it? Your question reveals an astounding absence of compassion. And second, I don't know if you realize it, but the work done, for the most part, by men, that's what lets you sit in a studio with your perfectly teased hair and present your opinions to the world. Society neglects men at its peril. Where are all the women lining up to do the shitty or difficult or onerous or unfulfilling jobs mostly done by men? Oh yeah, they're not. One would think that if you have no compassion at all for men, at least you would have the sense to realize that it's in everyone's best interest, including yours, to care about men's general health, well-being, and ability to function in society. I mean, seriously, think about it, Cathy. If we were to make everything other than things women have built, made, delivered, created, invented, discovered, or done disappear, you'd be sitting in a grass hut or a yurt interviewing Peterson over a dung fire.
Well, what sort of partner do you want? Do you want an overgrown child? Or do you want someone to contend with that's going to help you?
And this is where I think Peterson begins to understand exactly what he's dealing with. Whatever women in general might feel about the situation, the woman in front of him isn't going to respond to anything other than self-interest, just naked self-interest. Do you want an overgrown child for a partner? Well, that's true enough. But it struck me as pretty revealing that he felt this was the tack that he had to take with Cathy Newman, rather than something like this.
Look, last night, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. And so, yeah, well, every time, you see, because I see the same thing when I'm talking, my audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35, not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world. And the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
And so you're saying women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity?
It depends on what they want.
Now here's where I disagree with Peterson. Her assertion there that he's saying women have a duty is definitely a straw man of his previous statement. It's not what he said. But I honestly believe it's something he should have said and should continue to say. I mean, are men and women fellow travelers through life, or are we not? Are we as a society in this together, or are we not? If Peterson's message, the one that is so appealing to young men, is that you have a responsibility to be the best you can be and to find meaning and purpose in life, and that once you have your house in order, it's your responsibility to contribute something positive to the world and other people, and to reduce suffering where you see it. What he's saying is that we all have a duty to play fair, act kindly, foster understanding, speak the truth, or at least don't lie, and make a positive impact on those around us. His message is that it is our duty to take the gifts given to us by all of those men and women who have lived and died and suffered and struggled to bring us to this amazing, miraculous time and place, and not only appreciate and enjoy what they have given us, but to pay it forward. And if we all have this duty, then young women do too. They have a duty toward others, including men and boys. And what does it say about women that so few of them find his message appealing? What does it say about men that so many of them do? And what does it say about Cathy Newman that she seems affronted by the suggestion that she owes anything whatsoever to men?
No, I mean, it's exactly how I laid it out. Like, women deeply want men who are competent and powerful, and I don't mean power in that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Power is competence. And why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a competent partner.
So
if you want domination,
want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say women who have had their relationships impaired, their relationships with men impaired, and who are afraid of such relationships will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution.
Do you think that's what a lot of women are doing?
I think there's a substantial minority of women who do that. And I think it's very bad for them. They're very unhappy. It's very bad for their partners, although the partners get the advantage of not having to take any responsibility.
But what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
Cathy, what if he had said to you, some men who have had their relationships with women impaired, and who are afraid of such relationships, will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution. It does no one any good. It's very bad for them. It's very bad for their partners, although their partners get the advantage of not having to take any responsibility. Would you have said, but what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how men want their relationships. Would you? Really? Tell me the truth, Cathy. Or at least don't lie. You would describe that kind of relationship as abusive toward the female partner. You would have criticized Peterson for not going far enough in condemning such a relationship. You would have said something along the lines of, "What do you mean by suboptimal for the man? I'd call that abusive on his part, and we should be concerned with his wife. And how can you even suggest that a woman dominated by her husband gets some sort of advantage out of it?" You know you would have said something like that. So do I, and so does everyone.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
Okay, you said it was making them miserable.
Yes, it is. And it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time.
Nice subtle dig, Jordan. I think it went over Cathy's head, though. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get on to the next thing.
But I want to put to you that here in the UK, for example, let's take that as an example, the gender pay gap stands at just over 9%. You've got women at the BBC recently saying that the broadcaster is illegally paying them less than men to do the same job. You've got only 7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
So it seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
It does seem that way, but multivariate analysis of the pay gap indicate that it doesn't exist.
But that's just not true, is it?
That's
I mean, that
absolutely
9% pay gap, that's a gap between median hourly earnings between men and women.
But there's
that exists.
Yeah, but there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is gender, but it's not the only reason. Like if you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. Like you say, well, women in aggregate are paid less than men. Okay, well, then we break it down by age, we break it down by occupation, we break it down by interest, we break it down by personality.
But you're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top, because that's what's skewing that gender pay gap, isn't it? You're saying, well, that's just a fact of life. Women aren't necessarily going to get to the top.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
You're saying it's a fact
there are
of
multiple
life.
reasons for it.
Yeah, but those reasons, why should women put up with those reasons?
Oh my God, Cathy. Isn't this like saying, why should women put up with themselves? I mean, if the reasons are mostly about women making choices based on their personalities and preferences and all,
why should women be content
I'm not saying
to
that
get
they
to the
should
top?
put up with it. I'm saying that the claim that the wage gap between men and women is only due to sex is wrong. And it is wrong. There's no doubt about that. The multivariate analysis have been done. So I can give you an example.
You keep on talking about multivariate analysis.
Let me give you an example.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists.
Of course you're not saying why it exists. You don't care why it exists, even though it's only if you understand why something exists that you can determine if it's indicative of a problem. And it's only through understanding why a problem exists that you have any hope of solving it.
Now, if you're a woman, that seems pretty unfair.
Only if you're a moron or uninformed.
You have to say why it exists.
But do you agree that it's unfair? If you're a woman...
Not necessarily.
And on average, you're getting paid 9% less than a man. That's not fair, is it?
You're a barista, and on average, you're getting paid 9% less than a long-haul truck driver. That's not fair, is it?
It depends on why it's happening. I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait known as agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And agreeable people get paid less than less agreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men.
Again, a vast generalization.
Women earn 9% less than men. Not a generalization. Women are more agreeable than men. A vast generalization. So, to address a statistical assertion, one is not allowed to use statistical data, because then one is generalizing. Alrighty then. Skipping forward a bit.
Well, I made the argument there. It's like it depends on
So
who
you don't
defines
believe
it.
in equal pay?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Because a lot of people listening to you will just say, I mean, are we going back to the dark
That's
ages
because they're actually
here?
not listening.
I'm
They're just
listening very
projecting
carefully,
what
and
they
I'm
think.
hearing you basically saying women need to just accept they're never going to make it on equal terms.
Women do make it on equal terms, Cathy. Most women just don't like the terms.
I mean, look at your situation. You're hardly unsuccessful.
Yeah, and I have
How do
battled
you
quite
manage
hard
it?
to get where I've got
Exactly.
to.
Good
So
for
that's
you.
okay. Battling is good. This is all
It's
about the fight.
inevitable.
But you talk about men
Why
fighting. I mean, let me
wouldn't you
just put another thing to you from the book.
Why
You're
wouldn't
saying
you have to
real...
battle for a high-quality position?
Well, I notice in your book...
Well, why shouldn't you have to battle for a high-quality position? Well, I'm going to change the subject now rather than answer your question.
You talk about real conversations between men containing, quote, an underlying threat of physicality.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
What about real conversations between women? Is that something, or are we sort of too amenable and reasonable?
No, it's just that the domain of physical conflict is sort of off limits for you.
Well,
And
you
it's
just said
rather
that I've
unfortunate.
fought to get where I've got.
Yeah, but
What does that make me?
well,
a
I
sort of
don't
proxy
imagine.
man or
I
something?
don't imagine that yeah, to some degree, I suspect you're not very agreeable.
So that's the thing. Successful women, I'm not very agreeable.
Right.
But
I've noticed that
successful-
actually in this conversation.
Well played, Dr. Peterson. Well played.
If you're going to be successful, you need to be smart, conscientious, and tough.
Well, here's a radical idea. Why don't the bosses adopt the male bosses, shall we say, adopt some female traits so that women don't have to fight and get their sharp elbows out for the pay rises? It's just accepted if they're doing the same job, they get the same pay.
Well, what's in it for men, Cathy? I mean, that's a pretty big ask. You're suggesting the men at the top perform a complete top-down restructuring of how everything works just for women. Not only are you asking them to do it to benefit women, you're asking them to do it at their own expense. And how do you know that this type of radical top-down restructuring would benefit anyone, other than a relatively small handful of women who'd make it into the 1%? How do you know that feminine traits would even be functional in the corporate sphere? If they're as good or better than what we have now, don't you think somebody would have stumbled on that and leveraged it to their advantage? Anyway, I honestly think that after your comment on what's in it for women to treat men and boys with basic fairness, dignity, compassion, and a base level of encouragement, your apparent sense of entitlement to men at the very top of society just rolling over and saying, "Please take the position, ma'am," that's a bit much. And if all women were like you, given your attitude, why would any man do anything to help women, Cathy? Unless there was something in it for him. Skipping ahead.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm
you
very
get my
glad that I have
point. No, but you
exercised
get my
my freedom of
point.
speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
And
do
that is
you-
what you should do. But
and
you're
do you
exercising
think-
your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
No, Cathy. You're not trying to work it out. You're not. You know it. I bet you he knows it too. You're not trying to work it out. You know exactly what it is he said. You know exactly what it is that means. What you're trying to do here is figure out a way around it. You're trying to figure out some way to restate his position such that it will make him look like the devil incarnate. Someone who's in favor of people's right to be complete and absolute dickheads without simultaneously denouncing your own right to do everything you have done thus far in this interview. You want to know why men might be more likely to be effective in climbing the hierarchy to positions of power, Cathy? Take a lesson from Jordan Peterson. If he hadn't realized he could use your unbelievably offensive behavior toward him to nail your ass to a wall and win this debate in one fell swoop, he'd never have brought it up. When he did bring it up, he didn't whine, and he didn't play the victim, and he didn't even ask you to stop doing it. All he did was demand that the rules of the game apply to everybody, and you couldn't figure out a way to make those rules apply to him and not you. And so...
Ha, gotcha.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that grossly...
Well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian,
Yes,
which
but
they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a
No
tough
doubt
time
have
over
struggled
the years.
with it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, Chairman Mao, who
Just the
saw the
activists.
deaths of millions of people. Well,
Just the
even if the
activists.
activists, they're trans people too.
Not necessarily. At least not the people pushing this stuff. I mean, you don't get a bill passed in Parliament and authorized by the Senate solely on the votes of trans people, Cathy. Which only goes to Peterson's point. This isn't about trans people. It's about authoritarianism. It's about an ideology. It's about compelled speech based on theories cooked up in humanities departments that not only have no scientific backing, but that are contraindicated by what science we do have available, including the science around transgenderism. And it's about the larger ideology that has incorporated trans activism under its rubric. It literally reached out, a pseudopod, absorbed all of those trans people and said, now this thing, this mass of theories and bullshit, now it speaks for you. Was Bill C-16 the hill Peterson should have planted his flag on? Maybe not. But he had to pick a hill, didn't he? And now that his flag has attracted so much attention, he's barely talking about trans issues, let alone pronouns. It's only the progressive press who keep bringing it up because trans people in their exquisite social vulnerability make beautiful human shields. Oh, you want to fight us? You want to fight us, Dr. Peterson? Well, you're just going to have to mow down all of these trans people first. That's what you're doing. You're using a vulnerable population as a human shield to protect your ideology.
You're just saying things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never said
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to.
Who's provoking the public here, Cathy? He says that sexism against women doesn't account for anywhere near the 9% variation in pay between men and women, and you seem almost upset that he would say it, because then, oh my God, people might believe it, and then what would happen, Cathy? What would happen? If the pay gap is mostly due to men and women making choices that work for them based on their own preferences and priorities within a mostly fair system, then there'd be nothing for women to be angry about, would there? There'd be no reason for women to resent men, or feel stirred up and resentful and vindictive, or see men as having taken things away from them. Leading people to believe they are being treated unfairly when they're not is the definition of riling them up, wouldn't you say? So who is trying to rile people up, Cathy? Who here? Who is trying to provoke? Him or you?
Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back. And it's an injunction to be combative, not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
No, Cathy, no. What he's saying is that you can't blame white Western men, or even men in general, for inventing hierarchy. Hierarchy is an emergent property among social species. It just is, Cathy. It's wired into us. And we're just going to have to contend with it. On the bright side, Cathy, and as Peterson has pointed out innumerable times, there are innumerable iterations of a multitude of games, and our hierarchies are not solely based on physical dominance. A man might be at the bottom of the competence hierarchy in fisticuffs, but he might kick ass in a surgical theater or writing apps for iPhones. A woman might be unattractive or even infertile, but she might be smarter than her peers or more skilled in any number of things and be able to put that to use in terms of achieving success. Human males don't just butt their heads together like bighorn sheep do, Cathy, or go around pinching each other to fight for access to the best lobster pussy. We have managed to turn our biological inheritance, hierarchy, singular, into a massively complex system of flexible and overlapping hierarchies based on such widely varied criteria that they not only allow most men to be successful at something other than physically dominating others, they actually allow women to compete with men for a shot at equal success in nearly all endeavors. And that system of hierarchies, that's responsible for handing you every single thing you take for granted. The product you put in your hair that makes it look like ramen noodles, the lapel mic you're wearing, the studio you're sitting in, and all the technology that it took to put this pathetic, ridiculous excuse of an interview in front of 3.2 million pairs of eyes. And there you sit, in your designer outfit with your hair molded just so and your makeup perfectly applied by a professional, sitting in a studio at your high-power, high-status job, complaining that you, as a woman, have not been given enough by this system. That this insanely intricate and delicate system of distinctly human hierarchies that emerged among us as if through a miracle, and that has carried us from the primordial ooze where lobster males fight each other to disfigurement and death for the right to inseminate a female's eggs. You, Cathy, you complain that this system, it just hasn't done enough for you. We humans are stuck with hierarchy, Cathy, because we're animals and we evolved to thrive on it. It's built into us, and acknowledging that isn't saying we should live like the lobsters, for fuck's sake. And frankly, for someone who is so unbelievably focused on your own ability to acquire status, complaining about the lobsters is a little bit of pot and kettle, don't you think?
Aren't you just whipping people up into a state of anger and
Not at all.
Divisions between men and women?
And what's feminism other than a division between men and women, Cathy? What is it other than a philosophy that declares the interests of men and women to not only be fundamentally separate from one another, but also in conflict and competition with each other? Feminism pits men and women against each other regarding wages, regarding sex, regarding housework, regarding childcare, regarding emotional labor, regarding air conditioning, for crying out loud. Remember, Cathy, You were the one who said when Peterson talked about helping and encouraging men, "What's in it for women?" It's not Peterson who sees the opposite sex as the opposite team, Cathy. It's you and women like you.
You're stirring people up. You know, you have any critics of you online get absolutely lambasted by your followers. You've
And
got to
by
call
me,
them off, haven't
generally.
you? Sorry, your critics get lambasted by you. I mean,
If
isn't
they're
that
academics,
irresponsible?
not at all. If an academic is going to come
Okay.
after me and tell me that I'm not qualified and that I don't know what I'm talking about,
So
like,
you're
it's
not going to say
seriously
to your
not the
followers
same.
now, quit the abuse, quit the anger.
Well, we'd need some substantial examples of the abuse and the anger before I could detail that question.
There's a lot of it out there.
Let's take a more general perspective on that. So I've had 25,000 letters since June, something like that, from people who told me that I've brought them back from the brink of destruction. And so I'm perfectly willing to put that up against the rather vague accusations that my followers are making the lives of people that I've targeted miserable.
Jordan Peterson, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
So now apparently Channel 4 has been forced to hire a top security expert to advise them and Newman on whether she needs to be scared of the internet. Because there have been mean words directed toward her. And I'm just going to link all of you to a blog called Hequal that ran a bit of a search on abusive and violent comments on Twitter in response to this interview. And while I will say the results are not going to be comprehensive, because it would not have captured things like "we know where you live" and things like that, the search did include a number of words that would be considered violent or threatening, words like punch or rape or kill. And wouldn't you know it, it found that Cathy Newman's supporters directed 30 times as much of that kind of violent rhetoric at Peterson and his followers than the reverse. Kate Bevan, a well-known feminist pundit with a verified account, said that if she was in Newman's position, she would have punched Peterson. So I'm just wondering if maybe Peterson should be looking into getting more security. Anyway, my advice to you, Cathy, would be to stop being so disagreeable and start being more honest. Or grow a thicker skin. And if you do one of those things, you should be able to retire that fainting couch in no time. Anyway, have a nice day.
FreedomToons.
Every single in-depth look into the wage gap proves it's due to factors other than gender discrimination.
So you're saying that sexism is good and women should be paid less?
Well, it depends on what you mean by...
So you think sexism is good?
Well, it depends on what you mean by...
So what you're saying is women shouldn't have equal pay?
Well, it depends on what you mean by... Did you say all women? Well, it depends on what you mean by...
All women who don't follow traditional gender roles should be forced into electrotherapy?
Well, it would depend on what you mean by...
Women should all die?
I'm not bloody saying any of this. What's the point of interviewing someone if every time you get an answer from them you just ignore it and respond by saying, "So what you mean is blank," and then filling in the blank with whatever you want them to say instead of what they actually said?
So what you're saying is...
Hey folks, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider donating on Patreon to help me make more weekly cartoons about politics. Thank you.
I went into the Channel 4 studio and I sat and first in the green room where everything was quite friendly. Cathy was being made up in there, and so we had a pleasant interchange, I would say. And then I was brought into a room where the interview took place with the cameras, and we spoke for 2 or 3 minutes before the cameras rolled, and she was pleasant and engaging, distracted a bit, but it's exactly what you'd expect, right? She's got her mind on many things.
You can follow us both on Twitter and Twitter even, and of course Channel 4 News continues online, channel4.com/news.
But then the cameras went on and she just was a completely different person instantly. And so that was interesting. You know, it was interesting to me that she had both of those approaches so instantaneously at her disposal, you know. And so, of course, the first thing that entered my mind was, well, my eyebrows went up and I thought, okay, which of these two people is the real person, right? And then well, you could say she played devil's advocate. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. She laid out a set of ideological presuppositions, 2 sets actually, her set and my set. And the set of ideological presuppositions that she laid out for my side of the argument bore very little resemblance to anything that I think or say. And so she would ask me a question, which wasn't really a question. It was a barb with bait on the end of it.
Maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution. And I would respond, and then she would tell me...
So you're saying?
Yeah, she would say what I said, except then what she would say had nothing to do with what I'd saying. She was actually... She was fabricating on the fly the person that she hoped, the villain that she hoped I would be, and then insisting that that was me and that denying it was a lie. Essentially, that's what the interview was.
So we just get straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures.
So it's deeply insincere because she was playing an ideological persona, and she wanted you to play one as well.
Well, she wanted me to be the proper foil for that, you know, and was insistent, is the right word, that I abide by that particular decision.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay.
But there was more to the interview than that, because it was... I mean, I've had a lot of experience listening to people. Tens of thousands of hours of experience listening to people, because I'm a clinical psychologist and I've had an extensive practice and I've dealt with every sort of person you could possibly imagine, and a very large number of people that you couldn't imagine no matter how long you tried. So I was watching her after the first minute like a clinician instead of like an interviewer, and I was really paying attention to what she was doing. And I truly don't believe that anything she said in that entire interview was true on its own. It was all... I actually have a chapter about this in my book called Assume That the Person You're Listening to Knows Something You Don't, which is a taxonomy of conversational types and a discussion about how to engage in a conversation if what you're trying to do is further your knowledge of the truth. If both of you are trying to further your knowledge of the truth, which is a proper conversation, it's the highest form of conversation, not the only form. You could amuse each other too, that's a perfectly good form, or you can have a friendly spar, or you can play a primate dominance hierarchy game, which is very, very common, which is mostly what was happening in that interview. Yes, and it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time. But it's no formula for a successful long-term relationship. That's reciprocal, right? But she was using her words as tools to attain a particular kind of end. And I couldn't exactly figure out what the end was. Some of it would be to dominate the interviewee, especially if that's a person, then that would be contaminated with ideological correctness. You want to dominate your interviewee if you believe that they're wrong from an ideological perspective. And you want to do that, number one, to attain victory, and number two, to buttress your ideological points. So there was that. Then there was some devil's advocate, I suppose, and maybe that's more forgivable because you could say that she has a responsibility to do that as a journalist, which I don't believe, by the way. Asking difficult questions and playing the devil's advocate are not the same thing, even though sometimes playing the devil's advocate is necessary. And then I think there was an underlay of career grandstanding I don't know that much about her, and I don't know how she's made her reputation, but she is obviously a combative person, and my suspicions are that she's made a success of putting people, maybe she's made a success of herself in other ways, but she's made a success of herself, at least in part, by putting people uncomfortably on the spot.
My friend Jordan Peterson, who's really terrific, he was being interviewed on, I believe it was CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and he was asked by this interviewer about why he does not use the gendered pronouns that transgender people would appreciate. And this interview goes very, very poorly for the interviewer. I mean, this one goes under Peterson Destroys on YouTube. It's just hideous. Here we go.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I've exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. So and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
ha, gotcha.
Okay, so yes, that is a bad moment for her, because this is obviously true. Every political conversation I've ever had about these subjects is always, why should what you want to say trump my right to not hear you say it? It's like, because that's the definition of freedom of speech. And we can't have a conversation unless I'm actually telling you what I think.
Jordan Peterson is getting the Milo treatment. Maybe by now you've seen that amazing car crash interview on Channel 4. And if you haven't, watch the end of this and then immediately go to YouTube and find the 27 or the 29-minute version, because it's amazing. Now, Jordan Peterson is able to do what most of us only dream about, which is, and I've done it myself in interviews on occasion, but I don't always get it right. I have been on Channel 4 with Cathy Newman, who is a sort of hyper feminist British presenter. And she asked me some of the same questions with some of the same interview technique. Now, what Cathy Newman does, and I don't know because I haven't worked out whether this is all part of a clever strategy to get right-wingers to say weird and wacky and outrageous things, but what she'll do is she'll listen to a nuanced and complex answer to a contentious and emotionally charged subject, let's say the wage gap or campus rape culture, and she'll listen for sort of trigger words, and then she'll restate it's not even restating your argument. What she does is she uses a few words to construct an outrageous, so what you're saying is X statement, which has no relation whatsoever to what your original claim was. So you might say something like, well, if you perform a multivariate analysis, you discover actually that the wage gap is there for a variety of reasons, not just sex and certainly not just discrimination, but women's choices, different educational choices, women's priorities, and she'll cut you off and respond something like, so what you're saying is there's no point trying to fight for equality because it's never going to happen, and women should just get used to not being equal. And it's very difficult to respond to that kind of interviewing. And I don't know whether that's a result of she's either brilliant or actually her IQ is 75. Either way, it's effective when you're interviewing right-wingers, because anyone really, because she's able to caricature your position in the most grotesque terms in a very aggressive way that is designed to kind of get under people's skin. Now, Jordan Peterson gave a half-an-hour interview about a variety of different things. He has a new book coming out, his Guide to Life or 12 Steps to Happiness or whatever it is. He's got a new book coming out. He's talking about the wage gap. He's talking about equality, all kinds of things like that. And she's throwing these weird, crazy... They're not summaries of his positions, because they're actually in many cases the opposite of what he believes. She's listening for keywords or terms and throwing out aggressive, baseless questions designed to make him sound nuts. So she's asking, so you believe this? No, I never said that. Here's what I believe. So you believe this? No, I never said that. And this goes on for about half an hour, and it's absolutely gripping if you're really into this kind of stuff like I am. And if you're not, it's actually very bad television, but it demonstrates one of the strategies that they use to interview those of us who understand that not everything is really super simple, and you can't just say, oh, there's a wage gap of 9%, the world must stop turning until we fix it. Those of us who want to talk about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, women's different educational choices, yada, 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 there's sort of subtlety and complexity that modern feminism does not permit, and certainly feminism on television doesn't let you get away with. This is the stuff that can get people into trouble. Anyway, look, so this interview, grueling, half-an-hour viewing. It's either great television or a brilliant evisceration, a car crash for her, depending on your perspective. But what happened afterwards was even more telling than her interview technique. So, it's a perfect lesson, by the way. I'm going to talk to you later in the show about how this stuff works and why they do this. But I want to draw your attention to a Twitter thread from a user called Cheeky Scrump, who gets it exactly right. And I'm going to read you out what he said. He said, Cathy Newman got crushed on broadcast TV, and they're reframing her being laughed at as vicious, misogynistic abuse. That's not abuse from Peterson, but that's abuse from the comment section afterwards. People basically saying, haha, you got owned, or whatever, or, whatever it is, wrecked. This is we're going to talk in a minute about what exactly that abuse really looks like versus how it's reported in the press. But this user, Cheeky Scrum, I don't know who he is. He seems to be like a Dungeons & Dragons fan who also has great insight into gender politics. Must be a Gamergate guy. This is how the media will go after Peterson. You can bet your ass they'll never allow him on TV again because he destroyed them. The Guardian, doing stellar propaganda work as always, is saying Jordan Peterson has a large following in the, quote, alt-right, end quote, who fucking hate and mock him. Let me spell out exactly how this is going to go, says the user on Twitter. I'm going to read to you a page of his. This is because what he's done is he's seen it happen to me, and now he's seen it happen to Jordan Peterson, and now he's created this roadmap. And it's the neatest explanation of this that I've ever seen, including in my own columns. So I'm going to read the whole thing to you. Channel 4 and Cathy Newman know they got obliterated in that debate, and they aren't happy with their narrative being destroyed. There's going to be a media campaign to prevent this happening again. Step 1, which is where we are now, change the conversation from the loss of the debate to vile online abuse, having the vile online abuse that the debate has caused. Channel 4 are making a big show of this, hiring a security agent. They were very public about the fact they'd have to hire a security agent for Cathy Newman, but they're showing no evidence of the threats. Step 1, part 2, we're still here. The articles that are coming out about it, this huge media furore about the supposedly misogynistic abuse that the presenter is getting, allow the media to frame Jordan Peterson as being transphobic or hateful or whatever, and they help lies like him being alt-right because they'll try to associate the worst of what's happening on the internet with him just because we're all, of course, totally responsible for everything that all of our fans say at all times. This removes people from the primary source video and controls the narrative about what Jordan Peterson believes. So what they're doing is they're saying, well, because Jordan Peterson is surrounded by a load of harassers and abusers and threateners on the internet, that's what he believes too. He's just as bad as all of them. Now let's talk about how bad that abuse was. Interestingly, in this conversation, the question of what was said in the debate and who won and who said what and who you agree with is starting to become a bit muddier because the attention isn't on that anymore. The attention is not on what was on television, what was said. The attention is now on the story around this show. So step 2, says this guy, Peterson will be asked to disavow his own fan base, and he'll be conflated with any and all abuse online that women receive. His refusal to roll over in the face of this will be framed as an endorsement of harassment, and the more naked-agendered media will carry endless hit pieces. Absolutely true. Happened to me. It's now happening to him. Having Jordan Peterson on a TV show or an event will be reframed as dangerous to women or endorsing a harasser, and he will be banned from UK events and interviews, and his events will be cancelled due to safety. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It should, because there was a mischievous homosexual fag who was experiencing just this same thing in June 2015 and all the way ever since, right up until today. So, what this demonstrates is great that this is happening. What this demonstrates is not just me. being out there, being crazy, upsetting people, trolling people, having this band of whatever following me around everywhere that makes it impossible to interview me or impossible whatever. This is not a Milo problem. This is a left problem. This is a problem of their own invention and fabrication, their own making. And now they're doing it to Jordan Peterson, who is way more mild-mannered than I am. Far more beyond reproach than I am. I know that I upset people on purpose, and I'm perfectly happy to admit it. But Jordan Peterson is up there in Christina Hoff Sommers territory. So they're doing it to him too. Step 4. Peterson's mere presence on social media and YouTube will be called into question. Well, there we go. That's exactly what happened to me, isn't it? Calls will be made for his hateful rhetoric that encourages harassment to be banned from the internet. Marxist trans advocates are already doing this, but online media will follow suit. It's the same old strategy from the far left. If you lose a debate, reframe their arguments as harassment and ban, harass, and smear the person making them. They did this at full force to Milo, says the guy. The Belfast Telegraph released a headline. I got all this, by the way, from this Twitter account, and there's a great blog post I'll tell you about in a minute. The Belfast Telegraph says this: the anti-snowflake crusader. To his fans, Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson is a hero of rationality, but to his critics, he's an alt-right transphobe. To his critics, let me let you in on a little secret of the press, of the media, of how journalists work. To his critics is a sleight of hand. It's a fudge. It's a maneuver that enables the journalist to say about you what they secretly themselves want to say without having to cite anybody else saying it, without having to find out if anybody outside newsrooms and university campuses actually believes that, without having to find out if anyone at all believes that, aside from the specific writer of the piece and perhaps their editor. His critics say, in a headline, you'll find this as a curious pattern, and these headlines that say, critics allege, blah, 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 or according to his critics, blah, blah, blah. Very often in the piece itself, it shows no evidence whatsoever. There's no examples, there are no quotes, nothing. But the job has been done by that headline, because people sort of assume, oh, well, headlines are a sort of loose approximation of what the story contains. No, these headlines are being used to confect reputational damage. They're used to imagine criticisms that don't exist except in the furthest fringes of the far left. Imagine if a headline read, and this is the Twitter guy that I mentioned, to her critics, Linda Sarsour is an Islamist scam artist who wants to cut women's clits off. Well, that's what they're doing to Jordan Peterson. Also, compare the volume of coverage now. Compare the amount of coverage that you've seen about this supposed harassment crisis. And this is repeating itself as historic, again and again, Gamergate, Milo, all this stuff. Compare the amount of coverage that you're seeing about this harassment issue with the amount of coverage about the debate itself. Because the debate itself was ignored completely by the left and by the mainstream. Why? Because it embarrassed them so much, it obliterated them. And because Cathy Newman looks so retarded in it as well, next to somebody who so obviously intellectually outclassed her. There's been a problem with my interview giving too. So nobody's talking about it anymore. This is misdirection. This is doing it on purpose. This is a strategy. It's exactly the point. Nobody remembers anymore who was saying what. That's why they do it. It's a disaster for the left. But the only thing worse for the left, the only bigger disaster for the left, would be if Cathy Newman had received no misogynistic abuse. Because then what would they do?
By putting people uncomfortably on the spot.
Yeah. Still, women aren't going to make it. That's what you're really saying.
It depends on your measurement techniques. They're doing just fine in medicine. And so all those things were going on at the same time. And then, of course, underneath that is the fact that there was an ideological battle being played out. I would say a threefold ideological battle. There was a battle between her position, which was radically neo-Marxist, postmodernist, I would say. She was arguing against who she thought I was, and so that was the battle. And then there was the position I was trying to put forward, which had virtually nothing to do with what she was discussing.
She was fighting your strawman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it was like I was able to remain reasonably detached during the interview because I realized almost immediately that whoever she was talking to bore very little resemblance to me. Yeah. And so, I mean, she was quite sophisticated in some sense in what she did, because she did manage to sort of her claims became so preposterous and so self-contradictory that it was difficult to remain completely detached. And I think, and this was the crux of the interview, and I think the part that's attracted the most attention, she had asked me at one point in a provocatively self-righteous manner just what gave me the right to assume that my privilege of free speech, let's put it that way, gave me the right to potentially offend someone and hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while. You have...
And I thought about 6 things at the same time. But the first thing I thought was, you're a journalist. That's the last question in the world you should ever ask someone if you have any genuine integrity as a journalist, because that's all you have as a journalist. You have the right to offend people and hurt their feelings. And so I called her out on that, and I said, look, you know, all you've done in the last 20 minutes is everything you possibly could to make me as uncomfortable as you possibly can. Yeah. And I said it in a way that I would say was designed to let her know that I knew exactly what she was doing. And then I suggested that that was actually okay because she had every right to do that, but that she couldn't have it both ways. She couldn't make her living and her reputation using those tactics, let's say. And those, for her, those weren't tactics of seeking the truth. They were almost purely tactics of domination, right, and one-upmanship. Yeah. And maybe, you know, if you live in the postmodernist world, you don't believe in truth anyways. There's just victory and power games, and so perhaps that's what she was pursuing. I don't know exactly what she was pursuing, but it was so palpably obvious to the two of us at that point that she had, in fact, done nothing except try to make me uncomfortable, that calling her on it left her speechless. And then that was the only time, I would say, when I actually spoke to the genuine human being instead of the ideological
so the
front.
Ideological front, it fell off briefly, and then you said, I got you?
Yeah, well, I would say technically, and this might be interesting for people who are interested in Jungian psychology, if you want to understand what Carl Jung meant by animus possession, which is a very difficult concept, then that interview was a textbook case of having a discussion with someone who is animus possessed. And I can't explain what that means because it's very complicated, but if you go and read Jung and you read about animus possession and you need a demonstration of it so that that you get a sense of what it means, then that interview is exactly indicative of that. And I would say, as advice to people, maybe it's more like education, with anyone who is animus possessed, their goal is to engage you in the argument. If you engage in the argument on the terms they've defined, you lose. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. Yeah. You lose as soon as you engage in the argument. And so what I did in the interview was just not engage in the argument. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never say
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as when I say what I believe to be true, it's provocative. I don't provoke. Maybe for humor
You don't set out to
now
provoke.
and then. I'm not interested in provoking.
But what about the thing about, fighting and the lobster? Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a thing.
48 hours after Channel 4's disastrous live interview with Professor Jordan Peterson, the YouTube video Channel 4 somewhat ill-advisedly released has now attracted over 2 million views. And if you Google Jordan Peterson, Cathy Newman, you'll find a global interest in this clash of ideologies. There are links in Spanish and German and French and loads of other languages because there's this massive interest in this apparently innocuous interview. It's an extraordinary reaction to a political video. It doesn't compare in viewing figures to a Britney Spears vid in which she extols the virtues of veganism or leather handbag accessories, of course, but in political terms, this degree of global fascination in something as dull as the alleged gender wage gap is entirely unprecedented. So what is the driving force behind this Jordan-Cathy phenomenon? And the answer to that's easy. We hunger for real political debate in Britain because we're starved of real political debate in Britain. The authoritarian liberal elites control the means of information, and they never usually allow anyone like Professor Peterson anywhere near a studio. Their no platform for the right means that we're fed this unending diet of politically correct dogma via the mouths of the anointed liberal elite who know they don't represent popular opinion but who work tirelessly to make damn sure no one's allowed anywhere near the media bubble to propose a learned, valid, legitimate opinion. And this isn't because the liberal elite fear our ideology per se, it's because they fear being utterly unable to refute our ideology. And this no platforming doesn't just apply to the genuine right, it's aimed at every person and every idea which disagrees with a far left viewpoint. And this creates a massive pent-up demand in Britain to actually hear the unvarnished factual truth. And into this vacuum of truth stepped Professor Jordan Peterson, who somehow sneaked past the bouncers, he vaulted the tasseled gold ropes, and he whipped into the hallowed VIP liberal arena from where he was, most unusually, allowed to make his non-left-wing argument. And of course he won the argument hands down. He intellectually destroyed Cathy Newman, who was exposed for the close-minded, limited intelligence, slogan-shouting, unthinking leftist she so undoubtedly is. But this was so much more than just one wise and impartial person exposing another's ignorance and bias. This was an attack on the all-powerful authoritarian liberal establishment itself, and for the first time in Britain, or at least in my living memory, the liberal establishment was confronted and utterly traduced and utterly exposed. And this is why there's such interest in Jordan Peterson versus Channel 4, because he spoke for the disenfranchised millions of us who shout a great deal at the telly. But here was a man actually on the telly, live, unedited, uncensored, masterfully schooling the childlike social justice warrior Newman, the sort of person that we can only usually shout at. What an occasion! What a gift of oxygen for those of us suffocated by the dishonest, treacherous mainstream media mafia, who the number of big lies the mainstream media is able to keep in the air, courtesy of their totalitarian lockout of all counter-argument. Global warming is one, Islam is a religion of peace another, and gender fluidity yet another, amongst at least 20 big leftist lies. But in this particular instance, it was the gender pay gap lie that was completely dismantled by Professor Peterson, much to Cathy Newman's consternation, and as such the authoritarian liberal establishment was dealt a crushing blow, and one imagines that if C4 could turn the clock back, they wouldn't let Professor Peterson anywhere near them. The damage he has done to them is immense. But a Cathy Newman-Jordan Peterson contest was always going to be one-sided. Look at the stratospheric differences between them. Peterson is blessed with a high IQ and an inquiring mind, which he's built on over many years of deeply thinking on the realities of life and nature. His political leaning, which is classical liberal, was formed by viewing and looking at the real world around him, and he's now given voice to his opinions via books and videos which have been seized upon by millions of people. He's helped thousands of women become more assertive and achieve higher salaries, and he's given confidence to millions of young men who feel that they live their lives as second-class citizens in our new authoritarian, liberal, matriarchal utopia. But Cathy Newman, on the other hand, possesses only an above-average IQ, and she's done nothing constructive to make up for this otherwise excusable deficiency. She was never quite clever enough to question the bleeding obvious propaganda rammed down her throat at school and Oxford University. And as a consequence, she's absorbed it in its entirety. She's never actually thought, really seriously thought about anything at all. She's completely closed-minded. An inquiring mind is anathema to her. She's surrounded herself with identical people all of her professional life. In her social life, she never hears an opinion other than the opinion she was brainwashed into believing by her Marxist dons at Oxford University. She relies on manufactured grievance rather than substantive truth. She wants the world to mirror her fantastical political opinions rather than allowing reality to form her political opinions. And short of screeching inequality and patriarchy repetitively and loudly, she has done nothing to actually address the issues she purports to care greatly about. And if she lost the privilege of anchoring a prime-time national news channel and relied instead on YouTube to articulate her political views like Jordan Peterson, she wouldn't even be mocked. She'd simply be ignored. So when she came up against Professor Peterson, who was prepared to bravely speak substantive truth to dishonest privileged power, there was only ever going to be one winner. And Ms. Newman foolishly treated Professor Peterson as the enemy from the outset. She knew nothing about his background. She and her research team, if you can call them that, failed to recognise potential problems because they arrogantly imagined they were the intellectually impregnable anointed. And even worse, she failed to acknowledge the fact that Peterson works on behalf of all humanity. She couldn't recognise this because she's so wrapped up in her shrill, sloganist, selfish, feminist self. She shouted and she projected and insinuated, but she had no facts, no data, no research, nothing to back up anything she said. She smeared. She was disingenuous. She didn't listen. And when she was occasionally forced to listen, she either didn't register what the wise professor was actually saying, or it just went clean over her head. The gotcha moment is delicious, but it's painful to see how long it took for the obvious to finally dawn on her as the cogs slowly turned in the treacly mush of her propagandised brain. She allowed her unfounded prejudices toward Professor Peterson to cloud her moral, journalistic and intellectual judgment, if it could actually be described as such. And there are countless moments to enjoy in this video, but my personal favourite is when Ms. Newman expressed near total bemusement about far-left transgender activists being linked to the death of millions in Mao's China. And Professor Peterson gently and slowly explained to the recalcitrant Ms. Newman that it was the identical authoritarian leftist ideology that lay behind the slaughter of millions. But Ms. Newman, unfortunately, yet probably entirely predictably failed to follow this brand new concept of factual reality or historical reality. And an interesting question here would be, how far removed is Ms. Newman herself from the murder of all those who disagree with her authoritarian liberal ideology? Suppose Channel 4 made another catastrophic blunder and inexplicably allowed Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch 30 minutes of primetime TV to argue with clever Cathy against Islam being a religion of peace. Ms. Newman would have lost badly. She would have been publicly exposed as a witless dimwit, as a vapid ideologue. She would have become very angry. She would have compared Robert Spencer to a fascist, to a Nazi, an Islamophobe. Her eyes would have filled with passion and hate. And if given a choice between siding with the gentle Mr. Spencer or the ultra-violent leftist foot soldiers of Antifa, she would side with Antifa, a paramilitary leftist organisation that genuinely does desire to liquidate, to murder the erstwhile and honest Robert Spencer. And if the fragrant Cathy was a smidgen more intelligent and actually capable of critical thought, she might just startle herself in the knowledge of how close she and the entire authoritarian liberal establishment is, in ideological terms, to full-blown murderous far-left carnage. But she won't, though, because self-awareness is not really part of the liberal makeup. And a good example of this is the pathological refusal by Channel 4 journalists and producers to recognise the extent of their exposure and to actually try to put right the reasons behind this. Krishnan Guru Murthy tweeted his anguish over the loads, quote, of abusive tweets attacking poor, defenceless, frail, feminine Cathy. So I asked him, in his role as a fearless, incisive, investigative Channel 4 journalist, whether he could clarify what he meant by loads. He didn't reply, but it would seem that the loads apparently is 1% of the comments are abusive, which means that the valid 99% of the comments are now being ignored by Channel 4 in their totality. And by doing this, they add insult to injury. They first underestimate Professor Peterson, then they try to smear him as an alt-right sexist promoting misogyny and the patriarchy. And when this spectacularly backfires, they then accuse everyone who agreed with Professor Peterson of being misogynistic fascists. And as such, they don't feel they need to explain just why Channel 4 behaves as it has done and is continuing to do so. So, in other words, they view constructive criticism as a hate crime, or at least they pretend to do, in order to ignore it completely whilst feeling morally justified in doing so. How convenient. How achingly totalitarian. And I can just picture the Channel 4 newsroom late 2 nights ago. Krishnan Guru Murthy, John without an H, down with the Glastonbury kids, fuck the Tories, Snow, and the tremulous Cathy herself, looking through the comments and screeching, there, look at this misogynistic one, what ghastly, oh, excuse me, what ghastly, fascistic little lumpen proletarians they are. And of course they'll totally ignore the legitimate criticism, because as the new aristocracy, they're above all that sort of lowbrow plebeian vulgarity. And this is also something they're unaware of. They really are the new bourgeois aristocracy rather than the revolutionary vanguard they witlessly believe themselves to be. And Cathy Newman and her fellow travellers are part of the elite who provide the intellectual foundation for the social justice movement. They're mostly middling intelligence but highly educated white, middle and upper class intellectuals from the political left in advanced Western economies. And over the past few decades, this group has become increasingly powerful, and it's now become the new bourgeoisie, much like the one Marx and the early critical theorists sought to overthrow. And this new 21st century bourgeois aristocracy utilises many of the mechanisms the totalitarian communists use in controlling society, suppressing criticism through control of the news media and now social social media, enforcing rigid etiquette in speech and behaviour, using the education system to teach its values, and most importantly, representing its own interest as universal values and beliefs, and denouncing and demonising any person who suggests an alternative viewpoint. Stalin's saboteurs and fascists have become today's racist Islamophobes and alt-righters. Alt-right and provocateur, incidentally, were two smears thrown at Professor Peterson by the egregious Ms. Newman, and in rather a provocative manner, I thought. Marx always claimed the aristocracy was maintained the cultural hegemony because they controlled the means of production. But the BBC, Channel 4 and the entire mainstream media mafia now control completely the culture because they now control completely the means of information. Occasionally they muck up and let a genuine counter-revolutionary like Professor Peterson intrude into their bourgeois safe space and cause absolute intellectual havoc. They won't let this happen again in a hurry, of course, because they just won't. But meanwhile, let us rejoice in watching a free-thinking, impartial, highly intelligent man expose the authoritarian left in all its useless, dangerous, dishonest, misandrist, close-minded, hypocritical, disingenuous, privileged, manipulative, treacherous, anti-Western, divisive and bourgeois pseudo-glory. Watch it again and enjoy.